All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's about 1:01 here Central Time by my clock. Welcome everyone. We appreciate everyone logging into our webinar today and joining Jim and I. Those of you not familiar with MIRATECH, we're a manufacturer of exhaust systems, emission controls, and acoustic controls for engines and gas turbines. I'm Nick Detour. I'm the manager of our power generation sales division, and I'm joined by Jim McDonald, who's our director of environmental impact. Jim has nearly 30 years, or maybe over 30 years, experience in the engine and emissions control business. He's almost as old as I am. And Jim, as many of you may know, he's been around the block many times and extremely knowledgeable on emission regulations as well as equipment and controls. As the shift to renewables continue, there's still a place for cost-effective, rapid response backup power, such as the diesel generator set. And however, diesels get kind of a bad rap for being dirty, but they have a place in this transition to renewables. So today we're going to talk about Tier 5, which is our take on the next level of emission control, and defending your diesels. So how can we help defend the use of the diesels as we transition away from fossil fuels. Feel free to send any questions in via the question box on your screen, and when we get to the end, we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can within the allotted time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and off we go.
Great, thanks, Nick. I'm going to, as I walk through this presentation, I'm going to turn off my webcam and just focus on the presentation itself. As Nick mentioned, really, Tier 5, defending your diesels, what this is all about is just extending the use of diesels until renewable options are as clean as they say they are, affordable, and proven, because nothing's more reliable than the diesel engine. And we think that by working through this, we're going to be able to extend that availability of diesel engines as a viable option as long as humanly possible. So let's start by defending, to some extent, the data center industry. So data centers have been in the spotlight since about 2012. That's when this guy named Jim Glantz wrote the first article about power pollution in the internet. This was a big deal in September of 2012. It shone a light on data centers, especially in Northern Virginia, and the expression he kept using is their vast waste of energy. So he was focused on the fact that they were huge power consumers, and he found a lot of waste in the use of that power. He also did pick on the diesel engines, though, as part of that expose. Within weeks of that, everyone reacted to it, and it started a progression of the development of the parameter called PUE, and we'll talk about that further. Next, in 2015, Greenpeace came out with an article called Clicking Green. This was an analysis of all the data centers. Again, Northern Virginia was targeted. They graded all the different data centers. In particular, they focused on the big hyperscale groups, but also took a look at colos, and they gave them all grades, A, B, C, D, and F. And they graded you on your PUE, which is, again, the efficiency of the data center. They graded you on how forthcoming you were with the data. They graded on your use of diesel and your commitment to renewables. I mean, how much renewables were you funding either on site or in another location? All along, there's also been public notice. Public notice is the idea of when you're going to build a data center and you go for your permit to construct, the idea that you have to notify the public. You have to put a sign up in the post office or something out in the newspaper saying, okay, we're building this data center, we're putting in 60 diesel engines, and why don't you come on out and tell us how you feel about that. Some of these public notice things can be energized. I've been to a few of these meetings in Quincy, Washington. It seems like the folks come out and they can be fairly vocal. We're trying to give the data centers an opportunity to defend what they're doing. It's very hard to stand up and say you're going to put in 60 tier 2 diesel engines and emit a certain amount of NOx and a certain amount of PM. But if you say we're putting in tier 5 diesel generators, tier 4 is the gold standard according to the EPA, and we're going beyond that, it would be pretty hard for someone in the audience to say that you weren't making every effort to make it as green as possible. So the scary thing that's happening is all based on all of this pressure. Some of the larger groups have basically said that they're moving away from diesel. So the first time this was even mentioned that I could recall was in 2012. Within weeks of the Glance paper, Microsoft said they were limiting backup generators, diesel backup generators. So again, that was 8 years ago, and it was kind of loosey-goosey at that time. I mean, Microsoft has put in a lot of backup diesels since then, but right now they came out this summer and reiterated that and now put a stricter timeline on it. They said by 2030. If we believed that renewables were available, again, clean as they say they are, affordable and proven by 2030, there'd be nothing left to talk about. But we really do believe that we're going to need a longer runway to get to that point, and we're going to try to salvage the diesel engine as long as we possibly can. So this is the emblem that keeps me up at night. Anyway, so defending the data centers, you've got to be really look at all of their efforts, and they should be quite proud of what they've accomplished. They've all made various renewable goals. They all have directors of sustainability. They're all coming out with statements and commitments, whether it's carbon neutral or carbon negative. A zero carbon footprint data center is essentially, they're basically saying that all of their power that they are using throughout the year is displaced by renewables, either on-site or off-site, and we'll get into what that means as we get through this. But it is pretty incredible what the data centers have done as far as build out of renewables. So this is from the spring of this year. So S&P Global is saying that up to 26,000 megawatts of corporate tied renewable, 16,000 are either contracted by technology companies or data center operators. So think about that. The total solar and wind in this country right now stands at just shy of 9%. If the data centers weren't funding the majority of this, it would be half of that. So the data centers have gone above and beyond their commitments to renewables, and they're really backing a lot of the progress that's being made. The smaller fine print thing on the left here is basically explaining that the things that are conducive to wind and solar aren't necessarily the things that are needed when you're building a data center. I mean, a data center, there's a real art to picking up the geographic location of a data center. You're going to need the fiber, obviously. You're going to need usually tax incentives come into play. You're going to need weather conditions. You don't want to build it in a hurricane zone or tornado alley. So sometimes they don't line up perfectly. And when they don't, what the data centers are forced to do is source these renewables remotely. So they're building solar and wind plants where aren't necessarily where the data centers are. And that's what this map is showing is they show the data centers are the squares that look like briefcases, and then the wind and solar are other locations. But it's pretty impressive this year alone. I mean, the RE100, if you haven't heard of the RE100, that's companies that have committed to 100% renewables. This is a snapshot as of a few weeks ago. In the country right now, the #1 consumer of green power is Google, with 7.5 gigawatts of green power at 106%. And as you go down, there's 8 things listed here, and 5 of them are data centers. All of those folks in red at the bottom, Apple, Facebook, Google, they're all in this RE100, and their commitment is real, and they're making a lot of progress. Here's what's tricky, though. If you take a look at a data center, you'll quite often see stuff like this. This is, here you have all 3 components, you will. So they talk about local generation of renewables being the greenest. So you've got your solar array sitting here right next to the data center. But don't be confused. That solar array I can't think of a one where there's an exception to this. That solar array is connected to the substation. It's not connected to the actual data center. So whenever, when the sun is right and you're in the middle of the day and is producing electrons, they're being shipped to the grid to be mixed in with the pool of the other electrons on the grid. But the entire time, the power to the data center is coming from that substation. So there is some confusion about this. The general public will think, well, they'll see a Google Earth picture of a data center in Maiden, North Carolina, and they'll see a 20 megawatt solar array next to the data center. Yes, it's there. Yes, it is producing power. But right on the other side of that data center is a substation, and that's what's connected to the servers and everything like that. So knowing that, as people become aware of the fact that these renewables are really just going back on the grid and they're using utility power to power the facility, they needed another target, and that target happens to be the backup diesel generators. So let's take a step back just for a second and talk about pollution versus emissions. And this is really important because sometimes they're lumped together and it causes confusion. Pollution is just a subset of emissions. Emissions, again, is ever coming out of the tailpipe. So in the bottom left there's the composition of air. You know this. There's 78, 79% nitrogen, 21% oxygen. It goes through the combustion process, and then you get what's on the right. You've got, nitrogen comes back out unreacted. CO2 is higher than when you started. But the pollution, and I'm going to define pollution for the purposes of our talk, and I don't want to get into a debate. The pollution in this discussion is defined as constituents that are harmful today, constituents that would affect you personally breathing them. So it's only 1% of the total emissions. Now, CO2 is an emission, but I'm not going to call it a pollutant. It does cause global warming, so it has an effect on our environment. But I'm going to refer to it as an emission, and it's a CO2 emission. So when all of these things, everything we've talked about, what the data centers are doing, they're combating global warming and they're combating CO2 emissions, but it isn't really addressing the pollution. So I just wanted to make that clear so that when we talk about emissions and we talk about pollution, it makes some sense. So let's just start again to be clear. What is Tier 5? Tier 5 is not a new EPA rule. And I hope I don't see people just jumping off in droves from this webinar because they came online to hear about a new EPA rule. It is not a new EPA rule. It is not a new adoptable rule. As Nick said, I've been doing this same thing for 30 years. I have never seen a company come out with a campaign, if you will, with aggressive targets, and then it turn into an EPA rule. That's just not how it works. An EPA rule takes, on average, 15 years to come into development. So it's not going to really happen in my working lifetime that they're going to adopt this. And there's nothing on the books right now regarding an EPA Tier 5. There's a Euro Stage 5, and that's a discussion for another day. And it's not a permitting hurdle. There's nothing about Tier 5 that's going to make it harder to get your permit. But let's talk about what it is. What it is leveraging state-of-the-art technology. Tier 4 final was proposed in 2005. In 15 years, the technology has come a long way, and we're going to squeeze every ounce of that technological advancement out of what we're doing now. What it is it's quantifiable emissions reductions to extendable allowable run hours. What that means is quite often when data centers build in phases, they'll put the first phase in and they'll have 50 to 100 run hours for those engines. And with each additional phase, they cut those hours shorter and shorter and shorter to stay below a facility cap. That's fine, it's prudent. At some point you cross over though when you're down to 2 hours of allowable testing time a year, where you've now sacrificed reliability of the whole system because you can't even test it. Tier 5 is going to give you the ability to extend those run hours back up to 50 or whatever you started with, or pretty darn close. It's obviously the greenest way to defend your diesels. It's pretty astronomical the levels of pollution we can get down to. A cost-saving measure. Okay, you're thinking, all right, Jim, you've lost your marbles. How can Tier 5 be a cost-saving measure? Well, what I mean by that is when you compare it, has anyone looked at the price of a hydrogen fuel cell with on-site power storage or on-site fuel storage and 10-second start time? It's astronomical what these renewable backup replacements would be. So if we can extend the lifetime of a diesel until those assets or those renewable options are proven and affordable, it's going to save the data center money because they're continuing to use the diesel engine that they trust. Yes, they're going to spend additional money to make it very, very clean, but a diesel engine is like a perfect prime mover. It has one fatal flaw, and that's the pollution. And this is overly dramatic. Yes, is it the salvation of the diesel engine? It might not save it for 100 years, but if it can extend it 10 or 20 years, if the diesel engine is right behind coal as far as being in the crosshairs of the environmental movement, and that's fine and it's understandable. So anything that we can do to really clean this diesel engine up is going to help keep it going. This is just the timeline of the regs. Again, we give webinars on regulations all the time. It just goes to show the point that Tier 2 came out 15 years ago. Tier 4 was announced 15 years ago. And there has been a step down in the emissions targets that basically stopped in 2015. It's time for something new, and we're just being proactive with it. It's not a regulation, but it's utilizing the technology and everything we've been able to advance. So there's really only 3 slides here where it's somewhat shameless self-promotion, but we're going to talk a little bit about MIRATECH here and what our device does. What we're trying to do is we're looking at the criteria pollutants, but we're also adding in air toxics and global warming potential emissions. Global warming potential emissions are emissions that have some global warming factor tied to them. It's usually in CO2 equivalent. You combine all of that and we talk about net environmental benefit. So Tier 5 also introduces real-time monitoring. So what you end up having is you've got the pollutants. Here's the criteria pollutants. The ones in red were addressed by Tier 4. Well, they were addressed by Tier 2, but they were also addressed by Tier 4 final. What we're adding when we go to Tier 5 is we've got some CO2 equivalent emissions, specifically N2O, PM, and NOx. Then we've got air toxics that we're going to give you a guarantee on, which is polyaromatic hydrocarbons, formaldehyde, and 20 other compounds. So when you're looking to the right, what this chart is showing is the orange is the step down in pollutants. So as you went from Tier 0 to Tier 5, there's going to be a step down in the pollution, obviously. But we're also assurance. What we mean by assurance is the monitoring. How do you know that the pollution or the exhaust constituents are what we say they are? So with each step, you're getting more and more monitoring and real-time monitoring. And now with Tier 5, you've got the advent of really accurate NOx sensors. You can tie those NOx sensors to DEF usage. An NSCR uses diesel exhaust fluid or urea, and you can tie that to fuel usage. So on the new monitoring devices that come with a Tier 5, you can wrap everything together and really know that you're hitting the emissions targets that you say you are. And therefore, the net environmental benefit, besides just lower emissions, is the assurance that you're definitely hitting what you say you are. So again, what Tier 5 system, what are you getting? You're getting all of these additional guarantees on other pollutants. You're getting the operational flexibility. You can increase your run hours at your facility if you employ these types of controls. It's cost effective compared to any hydrogen source or lithium ion batteries. If you were to try to price out 30 megawatts of lithium ion and the real estate that would take to set that all up. Obviously, there's health effects, by being green, and you're not only helping the people at your facility, you're helping the town downwind. It's the cleanest option. We basically gone to the cutting edge of what these types of controls can do. The compliance assurance, again, is the monitoring and the data logging. I know there's a number of consultants on the call. We're going to try to make your job easier by having, the engine is going to report some information to you, but this device also will encapsulate all of the operating parameters so that you know when you submit paperwork to the Air Board, it's very, very accurate. And then just waving the MIRATECH flag, we have US-based technical support that we think is unmatched. So from a packaging standpoint, we're going to be putting everything together in a cube, whether it's, so in there would be your SCR system, your oxidation catalyst, and your diesel particulate filters. We have both active and passive diesel particulate filters. The packaging has come a long way. Things are a lot smaller and compact now, easier to install. That includes the controls. So the controls are in the center picture there. You've got the urea tank, the air compressor, the pumps, the control cabinet, everything now we can package it together in an enclosure that is weather tight and climate controlled. And then you tie that all in together with the remote monitoring that I was talking about. So we've got, again, active and passive DPFs, and then this whole pre-packaged system, making it real easy from an install and operational standpoint. This again is kind of graphically showing what Tier 5 on the left. You can see Tier 5. It's a reduction in both PM and NOx, and it's a very, very high reductions off of Tier 2. That's there on the right. So we're giving you some things that look new. Would be the air toxics and the N2O commitment for reductions. So let's just talk about this parameter. I mentioned it very briefly earlier, generator versus utility. So if you, in the data center world, you understand something called PUE, which is power usage effectiveness. So after the Glanz article, the New York Times, and starting to talk about efficiency at data centers, they came up with this parameter to measure how much power is coming into the facility and how much you're using at the server, what's doing work, if you will, on the server level. The rest of it is not wasted. It's used for cooling and other things, but it's a great measure of efficiency. So what we're doing with the parameter known as GVU is we're taking a look at how clean is the generator compared to the grid delivering power to the facility. So our first customer for this product was in Northern Virginia. We did about a 6-week analysis, came out with a 30-page report to show them what a GVU would be, the comparison again of the generator compared to the Dominion supplied power coming to the facility. So this is a slide showing all of that. I'm going to break it down into pieces though, so that you get where we're going with it. Where you start with an analysis like this is you start at the utility level. You've got to take a look. We know what the Tier 5 generator puts out. That's pretty straightforward. So you've got to start at the utility and you got to look at what is their resource mix, what are their generation types. So usually you get a broad pie chart like the one on the left, but you really have to dig into it a lot deeper because, you know, just something that says natural gas, you know that those natural gas resources can be very old, they can be combined cycle, they can be boilers, they can be a million different things. So we really got to quantify their emissions and get a good picture of how much pollution is created for a certain amount of electrons being delivered to the facility. So you end up more with a pie chart like the one on the right. The great thing is that these resources are out there and available. I'm going to show you all of our references in a minute, but so usually you're dealing with data that's a year to 2 years old. eGrid is one we go to fairly often. eGrid is pretty accurate, but you'll see just across the top there in Virginia what the resource mix is in 2018. So when you're doing one of these analysis, you're going to look good if they got a lot of coal. You're going to look bad if they got a lot of nuke, and that's the case of Virginia. They've got 31% nuclear, which goes down to zero emissions in any type of analysis like this. But we also look at the renewables. Now, the renewables in Virginia are actually pretty low, comparatively speaking, but they're also 4.9% biomass. Now, biomass is not pollutant-free. If anyone's seen that Planet of the Humans movie, which I'm a big fan of, but if you ever see the Planet of the Humans movie, you'll know that biomass actually creates NOx, CO, and hydrocarbons and PM. So you've got to quantify that. We're all about the accuracy here, whether it's good or bad as far as how we're going to look. So the map at the bottom there is similar to the one I showed earlier. See all the suitcases at the top? That's Loudoun County. That's where all the data centers are being built. Now, they're trying to put renewables into Virginia and Dominion's territory, and they're making a valiant effort on this. Is not at all a slight against what they're doing. But in reality, at $2 million an acre, you're not going to build a big solar farm in Ashburn, Virginia. you're going to build it down in the southern part of the state. But even that being said, all the circles there are solar, and you see it from the top. But even with all that added together, solar in Virginia is 1% or less. So now, what's the next step? So you've quantified what the resource mix is. Who's making the electrons in Virginia? Now you got to compare pollutants, because each type of pollutant is a little more damaging or a little less damaging than the other. The way to do this, again, this is also widely accepted technology, is using what they call marginal social costs. If you've ever seen an EPA administrator come out and do a press conference and they say, this rule is going to save 10,000 lives and $20 million, where did they get that from? They got it from this type of model, where they're basically saying each pollutant that is emitted is going to have a certain amount of health effects, and it's going to affect a certain amount of the population. So take NOx, for example. What does it do to the average person? And then how long does it stay in the atmosphere, and how many, when it's emitted from a exhaust stack, how long does it stay in the atmosphere, and what does it turn into? So you've got things like on the bottom left, where you're looking at if it reaches a person, what does it do to them? And then the EPA famous triangle on the right, where how many people does it really meet, and does it give you a headache, or does it kill you? And not to be callous, but basically you've got to take all of these things into account, and it puts it into a dollar amount. I know that seems very shallow to put a life into a dollar amount, but it's a way, from comparative purposes, you can justify a rule. You need to justify a rule as either making sense or not making sense. And this is the way you do it. If you've ever heard of social costs of carbon, this is probably the first time you came across this. Now, it's been in the EPA world for a long time, but because this is often talked about when we talk about a potential carbon tax, we're not going to get into that today, but when they talk about carbon tax, they talk about, well, what would a carbon tax be? What is the social cost of carbon when you're emitting CO2? And this is just a chart where you're sitting in the middle, and if you do something that increases emissions by 500,000 tons, and the social cost of carbon is $2 a ton, you've done $25 million worth of damage. Just to kind of shortcut it. Same thing, if you go to the right and you decrease 500,000 tons of carbon, what is the benefit you're creating for society? Right or wrong, that's how they do it. So in the pollutants that we're looking at, and we're looking at 8 different pollutants, here are the values that are accepted as the dollars per metric ton for these different pollutants. Again, NOx's example, $19,430 per metric ton. The chart on the right is just, again, an example. You would value something that traveled further or stayed in the atmosphere longer as higher, more damaging. So mercury that goes higher up into the atmosphere, it can be emitted in China and affect somebody in Hawaii. So that's why it's got a much higher number, not let alone the fact that it's a poison. So we take all of these marginal societal costs, and then we also add in line losses. If you're familiar with how the utility works, you're going to lose during transmission, you're going to lose some amount of that power. You still created the pollution to create that power, but when those electrons head down the high voltage wires, you're going to lose some. Now, we used to be able to assume 10% line losses, but now eGrid will give you a very defined average line losses for each utility. So again, in the sake of accuracy, we're going to use what the EPA tells us, or what EIA tells us. So that's 4.88% in Dominion. And again, we talk about renewables. There's some pollution associated with renewables. In the end, what do we get? We get a generator versus utility ratio. Again, it's the ratio of the environmental impact. That would be all of the pollution that comes out of our Tier 5 generator times the damaging effects, those numbers that I just talked about, social costs. You get a total dollar amount. And then you compare that for the same number of electrons created by the utility. I use 10 megawatts just because it helps me with the decimals, but it's just a ratio, so it doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. Again, it's very close to the power usage effectiveness parameter in theory when you look at it. So the 8 pollutants we're looking at are NOx, CO, hydrocarbons, particulate matter, SO2, which is sulfur compounds, mercury, air toxics, and CO2 equivalent. It's just a fraction, and that's all that is. So when you come all and you do all of that and you run the calculation, you know that if your ratio is 1.2 to 2, that means the utility is cleaner, and you should use the diesel engine sparingly. If they're about 1, which is 0.9 to 1.1, then they're within 10% of each other. So you would want to use, you can basically say in the summertime, usually, when the utility is using peakers, you know your diesel's cleaner. In the winter, it might be the reverse. But if you are below 0.9 in this GVU parameter, you know that the diesels are always going to be cleaner than the grid. And that's the case with Northern Virginia. We found that the GVU ended up being 0.81. This will change year to year as they retire coal and add renewables, but that is a very slow process. If they retire a nuke, it actually ends up getting worse. So that's Northern Virginia and GVU. I'm trying to honor everybody's time. It seems like I'm rushing, but I'm trying to, again, get through as much of this as I can. Here's the references. Again, putting this all together was a massive undertaking. The Tier 5 diesels it was pretty straightforward. We know our reduction efficiencies. Worst case scenario, we had to use AP42 factors or clean air or Oregon factors. For the rest of these folks here, if we didn't get a number, we actually cross-referenced every data point that we had. So if we got one data point from eGrid and it was different than EIA, or it was different than an environmentals group assessment, we did more research until we figured out who was right or what was missing, or if there was a bias in their numbers. So we think that these analyses are pretty bulletproof, and we're pretty proud of how it all works out. So before we go to the question and answer section, I wanted to give a final thought, which is a nod to Jerry Springer. Again, we're not anti-renewables. If you don't believe that renewables are the future, then you're kidding yourself. We think that diesel is the perfect bridge to a renewable horizon, and that's why I love this picture and I show it all the time. We think that diesels if you can clean up a diesel, it's just the perfect fuel to utilize until you get to that point of affordable, proven, cost-effective renewables. So there's all these misconceptions about diesel. So, and this is usually at the point in the presentation where the natural gas guys will start shooting arrows at the diesel guys, and the diesel guys will start shooting arrows at the natural gas guys, natural gas engine guys. And that's counterproductive. Again, if my goal is to tell you that we want to keep the diesel until something is clean, affordable, and proven, a natural gas engine is clean, affordable, and proven. So we have nothing against natural gas engines. If somebody at a data center wants to use a natural gas engine and they believe it can start in 10 seconds or start whenever they need it to, and they believe that natural gas is an uninterruptible fuel supply, fantastic. God bless somebody who wants to use natural gas engines. We love it. So I wanted to just clear up one misconception, because you've got to look at all of these things from a holistic approach. So doing all this homework on Dominion, I'm on a listserv, but most of the environmental consultants are on these listservs, so that when a Title V permit comes in, you get a ping in your email, and you can read on a Saturday evening if you've got the free time, the Title V permit application that comes in. So in the spring, I got a Title V application for a wind farm being built off the coast of Virginia. Now, Dominion, for a number of different reasons. First of all, Dominion is a fantastic utility. Again, this is not a slight against Dominion. They're incredible to work with. They're very environmentally conscious. You wouldn't be building in all those data centers, wouldn't be constructing in Ashburn if they weren't. But so they've hitched their wagon to offshore wind. That's the future of renewables in Dominion's territory. So they're building their first offshore wind project is being constructed between 2022 and 2024. Price tag for this project is $315 million. It's 12 megawatts of capacity. It's 2 6-megawatt wind turbines. There's a 200-page report. It's very interesting if you have the time. And it reflects 42.4% net capacity. Now, what does that mean? That means that how much of the time is the wind turbines creating the power that they can? That's the best way to explain it. So that's somewhat aggressive for a wind turbine. The average is probably 30. Best in Europe is 35, but we're going to take them for their word. They believe that these wind turbines are going to be 42.4 net capacity. What's in the Virginia DEQ permit is the pollution created when you're building this wind turbine. So it gives it in a tons per year of pollution of NOx, CO, VOCs, PM, and SO2. So it is actually a major source for the 2 years of construction. Now, they say it's going to be 2 years of construction. It'd be a miracle if they were done in 2 years, but again, we're going to take them for their word. 2 years of construction, here's the pollution that's being created. So just for fun, why don't we do a comparison of these Tier 5 diesels, a 12 megawatt Tier 5 diesel plant onshore versus this offshore project. Let's assume we're building something similar to the upper right, which is just we're pouring a pad, we're putting diesels in enclosures, Tier 5 diesels, same 12 megawatts of capacity, and they're going to operate at 42.4% capacity factor. We're matching electron for electron with the wind farm. And there was some emissions constructing the upper right, we're pouring the cement, but it's a handful of tons, not hundreds of tons. So let's just compare for the criteria pollutant NOx, because we're running out of time. So here is cumulative tons over the 2-year construction cycle. I'm sorry, I'm a little obsessed with the $315 million price tag. But there's your NOx from your wind turbine over the 2 years. So you built it, all of the NOx created from the project is in the first 2 years, and then there is no more NOx created for the next 30 years. So then we build our Tier 5 gen. There's a little bit of NOx during the initial construction, but then it goes up over time. So this is the running at that capacity factor, matching the output of the wind turbine. You can see that NOx climbs until it eventually passes, and your wind turbine is cleaner in year 30. Anyone want to guess at the lifespan of an offshore wind turbine? It's 24 years. So this is not poking fun at wind turbines. This was a pilot project, and I'm sure there's going to be offshore wind, and it's going to do a lot of great things for the environment. I just want to shine a light on misconceptions about what a diesel can be and how clean it can be, and also just worth putting on there. That would be the price tag of our diesel plant. Anyway, so when this thing is done in its 24th year, you also would have to decommission it, and I didn't include any of those emissions with taking it apart. So it was 29 years before the NOx from our unit went over the wind turbine. It's 24 years for particulate matter, and it would take 140 years for the SO2 from our plant to match the wind turbine. So that's all I got, and I'm going to hand it back over to Nick for the question and answer. I haven't been tracking the questions as they came in. Hopefully we got a few.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
I'm looking through I don't see any questions. If anyone has anything, just type a note into the box, and we'll get to it. I know some of you are like me. Typing takes a little bit of time. So, but we appreciate everyone's attention. So I'm not seeing any questions, so we'll just give it a moment. But I think we appreciate everyone being here. Jim, that was quite informative. You tried to cram a lot of information into a short time. I appreciate that. So, all right. Well, I don't see any questions coming in. There will be an opportunity if people have something that they think about. Just pop us an email, contact us back through the link you got to join the webinar, or if you know who your regional manager is, reach out to them, and we can certainly get anything for you. So with that, we're going to close it out, and thank you again, everyone, and have a good day.